Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss disturbing news coming out of the UK vis-a-vis Islamophobia in that country, as well as racism. And of course, we've spoken about this a number of times on my show, but in this case, we're going to be speaking about the first muhajjaba or hijab-wearing mayor in the UK, specifically from Islington. She's quit from the Labour Party, of which she was a member, over quote-unquote racism, discrimination, and white man oppression, as her own words said. Now, she said that she was invited, for example, she's given a couple of examples of what she has gone through. She was invited to Labour's first National Women's Conference, in which she received a letter where her address was printed with the word simply Somalia. And of course, she found that offensive because, you know, how can you just be defined by your place of origin and not by your name? That struck her obviously as odd. Then she claims that she was blocked out of her official mayoral account on Twitter. And of course, there is a whole host of other such Islamophobic actions that she laid out, such as her colleagues blocking her from organizing a Muslim Eid event back in the year 2019. Now, is this racism? Is this Islamophobia? Which of the two is it? And what does this then mean? Because, you know, we talk a lot about Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, but this time we're now talking about the Labour Party and whether or not the Labour Party will properly deal with this and what this means for British society in general and Muslims' place within it. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Abda Malik, who is an associate at the University of Nottingham. She teaches Understanding Contemporary Society. She's joining us now from Nottingham. Abda, thank you very much for your time today and for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of this mayor's resignation? You know, she came out quite strongly, didn't she? She didn't try to make this simply just a quiet walk away from her position. She made it very clear about why she's leaving.
So the case of Waqar Ismail, unfortunately, in the UK is not uncommon. We're seeing Islamophobia on the rise, and the fact that she's openly come out to speak about her experiences is very much needed, because one of the things is that people within job environments and settings, particularly in the political discourse, have remained silent in terms of microaggressions and overt and covert forms of Islamophobia that they've experienced. Yes, there has been a call for the Conservative Party in terms of having an investigation into Islamophobia, but in terms of Labour as well, there are cases and across other parties. The APPG, or Parliamentary Group on British Muslims, as well as Muslim civic organisations in the UK, called for an investigation of Islamophobia to be looked at. And I think her case, what it shows is that this discrimination is not just exclusive to one party, and therefore it needs a proper investigation to occur. I think you earlier suggested whether this case of discrimination can be linked and is Islamophobic. Essentially, I would say that it is, and it's various forms of historical to the present types of racism that she's experienced.
Yeah.
You had earlier Tariq Madood last month on your program, and he defines Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism. So this is racism specifically based on your religiosity or religious affiliation, but also your visible identity as a Muslim. The APPG has also done lots of work in terms of defining Islamophobia and the need and the call for people who have faced and experienced Islamophobia to be able to bring those to account. Yeah. So currently, Islamophobia comes under hate crime. It's not distinct and distinguished as something that an individual who follows a Muslim faith is experiencing.
You know, I ask everybody, Abda, who show about this from the UK. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm always curious about this because, you know, the Muslim community, of course, in many Western countries, not just the UK, but the Muslim community in the UK especially has been there for so many generations. I'm talking specifically also about the Somali community and, you know, South Asian, and of course the list goes on about the different Muslims from different parts of the world that are based there for generations. But I wonder why now, or have we always had these sorts of issues happening, but now is just getting more attention?
I think these issues have occurred. I think you can go back. Muslims have been in the UK for since early 19th century, and I think 1960s they had a presence. So it was mainly on the idea of being Asian, so this included Sikh and also Hindus. In the 1980s, then identity politics came into play, where people were identifying as their religious affiliations. Islamophobia has been occurring a lot to do with post 9/11 and 7/7. I think why people are coming up and speaking about it now is trying to shed light and draw attention to it. It's always occurred in perhaps subtle ways, like you have it within various institutions in education, higher education, the government, the police, but people are now starting to report on their experiences much more vocally. There's a report done by the Women's Inequalities Committee by the government, and this report was looking at Muslims in employment, and this was done in 2015. And it showed that Muslim women face a triple penalty. So this is based on their gender, their ethnicity, and religion. So when they're trying to seek employment, they have to face this form of glass ceiling, but they face a triple penalty based on their identities and what they affiliate to. So I think, in answer to your question, it has existed and always has. I think people are becoming more confident and emboldened, also empowered to make their case known a lot more than previously. Even those, having said this, still there are many cases of Islamophobia and racism that remain underreported, and this can be due to stigma or the implications it has on progressing people's careers moving forward in the future.
You know, I don't want to put you completely on the spot personally, Abda, but, you know, as a person who wears the veil yourself also, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the narrative always about Muslim women is that they are oppressed and then they're forced into wearing the veil, even though, you know, the vast majority do so and choose to do so freely, right, of their own free will. It's sort of odd then, isn't it, that a Muslim woman then, even a mayor, for example, would be targeted with Islamophobia. You would think that the opposite should be done, right? If the narrative on the part of the media and the rest of and the government officials in some cases is that these women are oppressed, then why actually target them? I mean, that sort of seems like it defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
Well, we know that there's a rise of right-wing type politics that is occurring in the UK. Our own Prime Minister referred to Muslim women as letterboxers and bank robbers, those who are visibly Muslim and wore the niqab. So that in itself has only emboldened people to be overtly racist. From now with Brexit and what's occurred, you have it across the board. So people who are BAME or even from European countries are reporting on facing certain types of abuse and racism. So you also see lots of complaints happen recently via Ofcom, as a comedian was on a national show, and he faced lots of backlash for coming and talking about white fragility. I think on a personal level, I myself have worn hijab and have experienced different forms of racism. So one by the state and one then by citizens. So Schedule 7, which is legislation that was put together during and post 2005, and this is all based on stopping and searching people who can be identified or visibly seen as Muslim and detained, so you have legal representation, for example. And so I experienced that, and I went through that. At the same time, I was also then coming on a train journey and was attacked on a train by people who were attending a football match and coming from that. So these experiences, if you ask many people, and I have been in academia and I've been quite an active citizen doing lots of different things and contributing where I can. But even though I'm visibly there doing all these things, I'm not immune to, and a lot of Muslims are not immune to facing lots of racism, whether you're quite public or if you're just your everyday Muslim getting by and trying to get by within British society. And I think we see a rise of Islamophobia. It goes across not only the UK, but the US and in India. You have various examples of there is a movement, and it's monetized in terms of creating hostility and tensions towards Muslims. So I think one of the things you see as well is in media. So people are slowly drip-fed information which is inaccurate and associated to Muslims. Recently, within the BBC, there was a lot of coverage of COVID, and this was associated, the imagery was of Muslim women in hijab. So almost it's subtle in terms of making the assumption that Muslim women or Muslim minorities are kind of super spreaders of this virus.
You know, on that point you just made there, Abdul, it's interesting because, you know, during this pandemic, right, we've in fact had, and of course not just exclusively Muslim, but we've had a lot of minorities within the UK who have been essential, right, in this fight against this virus as NHS workers in different, you know, positions, be they doctors, nurses, etc. And a lot of them, of course, being Muslim, some visibly Muslim as well. It's odd then, right, that even in this sort of atmosphere where you would think that more credit should in fact be given to minorities, that in fact we're having more racism occur. Why do you think that's happening?
Well, I think you've seen some research done by BEMA, and we wrote a paper with the British Medical Journal with BEMA with regard to Muslims trying to have career progression. So you find lots of Muslim women going into surgery because they didn't have the appropriate or adequate surgical hijab wearing theatre. So they ended up, many following and pursuing careers as a GP in terms of interaction and making it easier upon themselves. It's very sad. During the COVID crisis, we've seen that Muslims have been, many healthcare professionals have been at the front line and have been ones who unfortunately lost their lives during this pandemic. And one thing that's governed them and governed many of these doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals is their faith to serve humanity, and this is governed by the religion, and the contributions that they're making are being noticed somewhat within the media, but there are still issues, and it's prevalent in terms of a lot of racism. You notice that within BME communities, accessing healthcare and support, they're hesitant to do so because they feel if they go in NHS that they will face some form of racism or inequalities, and so they are staying home longer and not getting the adequate treatment if they are having cases of COVID. And this is also leading to the figures in terms of rise of YBME communities. There's a rise within them in terms of COVID cases also. With other issues around other minorities, I think that there is a lot of stigma for being a minority group, and it's been geared and manufactured in a particular way. And racism comes and is coming from a state base from the top. So within political discourses, rhetoric and media narratives, that's helping to create tension between people and hostility. So this is adding to it. You probably come across Miqdad Versai's work within the Muslim Council of Britain. Yeah. He reported on Islamophobia, how it's kind of engineered and manufactured within the media and also in other aspects. And healthcare is something that we focused on within BEMA.
Yeah. You know, I wonder on that topic of, you know, other minorities as well. We know, right, that whenever there's hatred towards one group of people, right, in this case we're talking specifically, of course, about Muslims in the UK, but it's very easy to translate that, unfortunately, onto other minorities, right, or to other people of other faiths and ethnicities, you know. So we can talk about anti-Semitism. I mean, this has happened in many parts of Europe where side by side in Germany, for example, we have both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and attacks both ways. And I believe that may be the case specifically in the UK also. And of course, racism towards East Asians, especially in the context of this pandemic also. Is there then enough solidarity? Is there enough understanding, do you think, between the Muslim community and those other communities that they need to work together to you know, resolve this and to tackle this issue?
I think one of the things you noticed from the research we did at BEMA, it was to work with those who wear headwear. So this included Sikh minorities, healthcare professionals, and also Jewish minorities who wore the kippah. And this has been, many of these healthcare professionals have come together through NHS England and NHS Improvement based on our findings to change policy. So there is some collaborative work done. Having said the Labour Party was scrutinised with regards to cases of antisemitism and dealing with that. And it will be interesting to see, in the case of Waqar Ismail, if issues around and investigations around Islamophobia follow suit. I think there's a lot you can draw from antisemitism, whether it's European definition, but also parallels of how community is vilified and treated as the other, and this othering effect then dehumanizes them to a point where people don't feel any empathy or regard for their experiences. So then I think there's a lot to learn in terms of definitions of anti-Semitism, and one of the frameworks of it is that it has a lot of backing from a legal perspective, and in that sense, the All-Parliamentary Group on Muslims has been trying very hard to get Islamophobia the same type of recognition, so that legally people who are attacking people based on faith are prosecuted adequately and not just under a broad definition of hate crime. So yes, I think there is a lot that can be done. Working in collaboration definitely has its benefits, because minorities are all now experiencing lots of challenges. So if you're Chinese minorities within the UK are having so much backlash because of the COVID crisis. And so people are now coming together and trying to work out ways to challenge the racism that they are facing. And I think one of the mobilizing factors was a lot of the work around Black Matter movement, which happened early in the summer post the death of the tragic killing of George Floyd. And so
on that point of the Black Lives Matter movement, if I may come in, Abda, I don't want to take away from the fact that, of course, we've spoken about the fact that Ms. Ismail is, of course, a Muslim woman, a visibly Muslim woman, but she's also, of course, a Black Muslim woman, right? She is of Somali origin. How important do you think that has been in the racism and the Islamophobia that she has faced? Because, I would imagine that is also a significant factor, right? Considering we now all realize the fact that having darker skin, unfortunately, is just a reality at this point in time, at least in many places in the world, just means that you are treated differently by authorities than by those around you?
Yes, I think you have the case. I'm not sure if you've come across a schoolgirl named Shukri Abdi, and she was from a Black background, and she had been bullied at school, and then she drowned as a result. But the family have been calling for a proper investigation to occur based on what had happened, because they still didn't get proper answers to her death. And those that were involved should then be prosecuted, but that hasn't gained the attention. Now, through the Black Lives Matter movement, that started to get some traction. There's also been a lot of focus on a conference recently is being held on the Black Muslim Renaissance to show Muslims who are from a Black heritage and background to shine spotlight in terms of their contributions, but also show the external racism that they experience, but also internally within Muslim communities, and have discussions and conversations about that. I think that's starting to occur, and there's starting to be a shift and attention. And quite rightly, you pointed out that from an ethnically based background, so if you're a white convert, your experiences will differ very much from, say, someone who is from it may be a Black convert or who is Black and Muslim and born Muslim. Those experiences will be different, and how they are then shaped within that, and the privileges that go within that as well for one group over another need to be kind of further examined and researched.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there as a final word, Abda. We do sincerely appreciate you taking out so much of your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us here in Scope. That was Dr. Abda Malik speaking to us there from Nottingham, sharing her expertise with us about both Islamophobia and racism, and the sort of merge of that when it comes to this case of this mayor who quit from the Labour Party, the mayor of Islington. She was Ms. Ismail, who is of Somali origin, and of course is a visible Muslim who wears the hijab as well, or the veil. She says that she suffered Islamophobia and racism at the hands of Labour Party members. Even at the first Labour Party Women's Conference, she was invited. Her address was written down simply as Somalia. She was blocked from her own mayoral Twitter account, at least for a while. And she was not allowed to hold a Muslim Eid event, even though mayors do have the right, quite clearly, to hold such events, considering their position. What does this then mean for the Labour Party, right? Because as I said in my introduction as well, it's easy to always pick on the Conservatives because their racism or quote-unquote disturbing rhetoric is sort of out in the open, right? And Labour's is less so, seemingly at least. It's sort of simmering under the surface, but that also needs to be dealt with. Is this down to the pandemic? Is this down to Brexit? Is this down to just something that's always been there now, getting more attention, as we discussed there with Abida as well? Those are all, of course, important issues to discuss so that we can get to the root of these sorts of hatred and prejudice and bias and then deal with that issue head on as well. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss social media and how it's playing out vis-a-vis the U.S. elections. And the biggest news is that Twitter has suspended a number of fake accounts that were claimed to have been owned by Black Trump supporters, and a lot of those accounts have been proven to, in fact, be fake, as I said, according to Twitter, saying that those accounts then broke its rules on spam and platform manipulation. However, there is another news piece as well, which is important, and I feel like it's important to add that on to this discussion as well to keep it balanced, is that the New York Post did a tell-all type piece about Hunter Biden specifically, that is Joe Biden's son, and his affiliations with the Ukrainian company, and we know that there's been a lot of controversy about that on the other side, and that Twitter and even Facebook tried to downplay, and in the case of Twitter, actually completely blocked people from being able to share that post as well. So what does this say then on both sides of the aisle about how social media is affecting how both sides are able to reach and or not their respective supporters, and whether or not both sides are in fact misusing social media as well in the case of this year's elections? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Sharon Austin, who is a professor of political science. She's also the editor of the American Political Science Review. She's joining us this morning from Middleburg, Ohio. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Mr. Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. Michael and Sharon, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Sharon, let me start with you, and let's start firstly with the main story about the Black Trump supporters, the fake Black Trump supporters, that is. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it hasn't been proven whose accounts these were or who did this, but it says a lot about the passion on both sides as far as this campaign. It's so contentious. It's probably the most contentious campaign I've seen throughout my lifetime. And it just says that someone obviously is either making a joke or is making an attempt to try to make it seem like there are more Black supporters for President Trump than there actually are. But until we find out exactly who did this, we don't know exactly what to make of it. But this is something that's very troubling.
It is troubling, isn't it? Because, whoever may have done it, and no one's, again, as Sharon said, we don't have the information right now to allege that, for example, the campaign may have had a part in this. But nevertheless, it just goes to show also that social media can be manipulated, can't it?
Social media has been attempted to be manipulated since it was invented a decade and a half or so ago. Look, this is not good. I think one of the things that social media has an obligation to do is to police their accounts and to ensure to the very best of their ability, and they do not do this, but to ensure to the very best of their ability that accounts are real. Phony accounts goes beyond what's reasonable. I understand it happens all the time. We knew that this happened, back in 4 years ago when the allegations were that there were multiple bots from content farms in Macedonia that were entering into Facebook. They really do a superbly bad job in terms of policing that. In terms of what actually happened, as Sharon pointed out, we don't know yet. It doesn't surprise me at all that campaigns would create fake accounts and try and create the illusion of something that's happening in a particular demographic sector that might not be happening. But it pales in comparison to what I think is our next topic that you're going to bring up, which is the Twitter and Facebook suppression of information that came out yesterday as well.
Yes. Let me do with this, and I will get to that, Michael, in just a moment. Sharon, on this topic then, just about how social media will affect these elections, right? I mean, we are in the midst of a pandemic, so we're not having the normal campaign, the status quo campaign that we would have expected in previous such presidential elections. So, there are a lot of challenges also for campaigns to get their word out. Now, if you do have bots and the above involved in all this muddies the waters, and then it gives more credence then, doesn't it, to arguments by Donald Trump, for example, that these may very well be rigged elections?
Well, I guess in a way you could say that, but nevertheless, in every presidential election year and with every presidential campaign, there's always something that's going to occur. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the results aren't accurate. It's just the kind of thing that you expect to see during an election year, especially for one like this, in which you have a president that's very divisive. You have a lot of questions also by some about Joe Biden. And so it's something that you expect. It doesn't necessarily say that the election results aren't valid, but it is going to be something that regardless of who the loser is in this election, that person is going to be able to make an argument that this was fraudulent. Social media has a huge role in terms of fundraising, in terms of the campaigning that both candidates have been doing, in terms of President Trump, who always has used Twitter. In terms of the Biden campaign, even President Obama was one of the first presidents to actually use social media to his advantage and really benefit from it. And now Joe Biden and President Trump are trying to do the same thing. So social media has a major role in this. And it could be argued that the results might be challenged on this basis. But I think that regardless of the outcome, we pretty much know that the results are going to be challenged regardless. We just don't know how they're going to be challenged, especially if President Trump loses. He's already made it clear that he is not going to concede, and we pretty much know that. And I think the same is true with Joe Biden. So social media is going to has a bigger role in this presidential election than in any election in U.S. history.
Okay, so Michael, let's then talk about. Of course, you can react to what Sharon there said, but I also want to then bring in, this issue about the New York Post and that investigation to Hunter Biden. And this is not, of course, a new issue, right? I mean, this has been spoken about for a significant amount of time now by Republicans. The moment it was understood that Joe Biden would be viable or the potential presidential candidate on the Democratic side, how big a deal is this? I mean, is this as Twitter's head has pointed out that this was not communicated well about why this link was not allowed to be posted on Twitter, as well as Facebook's very democratic democratic leaning official, I should say, had said that he would try to downplay that link as well while they investigated it. Is there really, do you think, a bias, as of course Republicans and Donald Trump have claimed for a long time that there's a bias against conservative voices on social media? Because, in my reading, when I go online and check out a lot of American political experts who are conservatives, they do say a lot of things online and get away with saying a lot too.
Yes, well, okay. The first part of your question first. I think Sharon is correct. There's not even an emerging importance of social media anymore. It has arrived. It is here. It is one of the campaign tools. If you don't know how to use social media to manipulate public opinion, which is what a campaign is all about, then you're not going to be successful at this level. So I agree with her. It's quite an important thing, which puts an extra responsibility on social media, I believe, to play it even-handed and fair. And by and large, I think that the conservative voices are correct that social media, the giants, particularly Facebook and Twitter, those two combined, are intentionally, not accidentally, but intentionally anti-conservative. I don't believe that the suppression of the New York Post article on Joe Biden's son and the influence peddling that he did with his father I don't believe it was an accident or a miscommunication or it was just an unacceptable form of bias. Remember, Twitter is the company that several years ago actually just suspended or deleted President Trump's account because they had an employee who didn't like what he was tweeting. Facebook, similarly, they suspend all kinds of conservative accounts, too numerable to recite here. But when you ask them for examples on the other side, which liberal accounts have you accidentally suspended or suspended for cause, there is no answer to that. They don't have them. So I would suggest to these giants, these corporate giants, that they should not be in the business of actually policing the message, but perhaps the time and energy that they waste in policing the message ought to be spent policing accounts to make sure that illegal, phony, fake bot accounts are deleted from their system so that real people can have real discussions.
Ashir, what are your thoughts on that? Do you believe that there is an anti-conservative bias on the part of these social media giants? And then what do you make of the New York Post, that entire debacle, right? The Twitter basically just blocking anyone from sharing even that link about Hunter Biden and you know, the corruption allegations against him?
I think that it's unacceptable to block anyone from sharing information. I think that they were trying to insinuate that this information wasn't true, but nevertheless, regardless of the context, it's not appropriate. But to answer the first part of the question, I think there is somewhat of a bias against conservatives through social media, but I think you also have to understand that sometimes people call themselves conservative, but really they're just using racist and sexist messages, bigoted messages. And so in that sense, they're blocked because those messages that they're sending are so incendiary. And so it's not so much even that they're offensive, it's just that they're completely inappropriate. So in that sense, people are blocked when they use things like slurs or when they say things that are completely untrue. I remember even some of the things that were said, especially about President Obama, Mrs. Obama. The same thing can be said about President Trump and Mrs. Trump, but President Obama and Mrs. Obama being the first black president, the first black first lady, a lot of the social media posts were just downright racist and vicious. So in that sense, they were blocked because they needed to be. Those were not people who were conservatives. Those are people who were racist. And in some cases, these have been people who have been members of hate groups. If that be the case, then there's not necessarily a bias. If you're blocked, you should expect to be. So it just depends on the context. But to answer the question, there definitely is a bias against conservatives. And that's just, I guess, the way it is through social media. I guess because a lot of younger people have more of a tendency to use it. They tend to have views that are a little bit more liberal and moderate than people who are older. And I think that probably plays a large part in it.
You know, Michael, I wanted to get your thoughts on what Sharon there said, because I'm just going to hone in on one example about a conservative voice, right? So we had Lauren Witzke, if I'm saying her name correctly, who is the U.S. Senate candidate in Delaware, and I'm sure you've heard about this tweet where she wrote, and I'm quoting her exactly, that most third world migrants cannot assimilate into civil societies. Prove me wrong. Now, obviously, that's quite an inflammatory thing to say, but I mean, and I'm not saying that should be blocked, but I'm just saying that when you have such inflammatory rhetoric online, should that just be let go? Do you think that that's just all part of what free speech is? Because it can be a lot worse, certainly, right? I mean, this is just one very small example in the larger scheme of things.
Yes, Waqar, as disgusting and offensive as something like that is, it does come under the guise of free speech here in America. We have the right to be offensive. We have the right to be even racist. You can't legislate someone and tell them they can't be racist. Woe for them for being such a despicable character, but they, particularly if they are a candidate for public office and a legitimate candidate for public office. This woman is on the ballot. she's not just, some kook running an independent writing campaign, then her views ought to be heard. And I would hope that when you do something like that, the American people would reject your views resoundingly. But again, as offensive as something like that is, and as inappropriate as it is, I would err on the side of the American Constitution guarantees free speech, and that's her political point of view.
Sharon, what are your thoughts about that?
I have to agree with that because regardless of how offensive someone's comments are, they have a right to them. And we do have, I think, too much political correctness in our society in the sense that people's speech is being closely monitored and being filtered and being censored. That's not a good thing. That's not what America has ever prided itself on. People have a right to say things regardless of whether they're offensive or not. But there are such things as fighting words. And there are words that aren't protected under the First Amendment in terms of free speech. But in most cases, I would say that I'm always happy to see someone who says something that is offensive. And I hate to say this, but that is racist in the sense that you need to know what your opponents are thinking. And you need to know if people have these types of views. If you're running for office and if you're foolish enough to say something that's racist or sexist or bigoted, then you need to be exposed. And those comments shouldn't be censored. They should be published and people should be made aware of them because usually you have done more harm to yourself by saying something that's inappropriate. So I agree that we have to fight for freedom of speech and freedom of expression. In America, that's something that we've always prided ourselves on having that right.
All right, well, we'll leave final word, but we really appreciate this very interesting discussion. That was Dr. Sharon Austin speaking to us from Middleburg in Ohio, and Michael Lane, who was speaking to us this morning from Washington, D.C., giving us their expertise about this issue of, Twitter suspending those number of fake accounts attributed to Black Trump supporters, and Twitter saying that those are fake. We do not yet know who created those accounts, so we can't necessarily blame the Trump campaign directly, but it may very well happen that both sides have created bots online to show that they have more support than they probably or maybe do have at this point in time in the campaign. Then, of course, we have the New York Post article, the one that's an investigation into Hunter Biden. A lot of Democrats have said this, it's a non-issue, considering it's an issue that's been spoken of so many times by Republicans, but nevertheless, for Republicans to have the right to at least share it online is now something under dispute because Twitter keeps blocking people from being able to share those things altogether. And even a Facebook official has said that Facebook is looking into misinformation when it comes to that article also. And then there's the issue of, free speech overall online. Should that be policed? Should it not be policed? What is then to be seen as hate speech, as something that goes too far? Or maybe there isn't anything that goes too far. I mean, you should, I would think, have some logical limits even on what we understand as free speech in today's world. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.